Power Corrupts, a biography of Lord Acton. By Jim Powell. Lord Acton was a 19th-century politician, historian, and writer best remembered for his commentary on the corrupting influence of power. During the 20th century, people tried everything they could think of to make governments do good. The voting franchise was extended, so governments would better reflect the will of a majority. In many places, each nationality got its own government. Political parties searched for the right rulers with enough compassion and justice. Bureaucracies were filled with trained technicians, enabling governments to plan for a better future. They commanded vast resources. Yet everywhere the results were horrifying, and the 20th century became the most oppressive in human history. Majorities oppressed minorities. Supposedly virtuous politicians turned out to be as brutal as the scoundrels. Nationality attacked nationality. Taxes soared. Few recognized the dangers of political power as clearly as Lord Acton. He understood that rulers put their own interests above all and will do just about anything to stay in power. They routinely lie. They smear their competitors. They seize private assets. They destroy property. Sometimes they assassinate people, even mark multitudes for slaughter. In his essays and lectures, Acton declared that political power was a source of evil, not redemption. He called socialism the worst enemy freedom has ever had to encounter. Acton sometimes rose to commanding eloquence when he affirmed that individual liberty is the moral standard by which governments must be judged. He believed that liberty occupies the final summit. It is almost, if not altogether, the sign, and the prize, and the motive in the onward and upward advance of the race. A people adverse to the institution of private property is without the first element of freedom. Liberty is not a means to a higher political end. It is itself the highest political end. Although Acton increasingly stood alone, he was admired for his extraordinary knowledge of history. He transmitted to the English-speaking world the rigor of studying history as much as possible from original sources, pioneered by 19th-century German scholars. His estate at Cannes, France, had more than 3,000 books and manuscripts. His estate at Tegernsee, Bavaria, some 4,000. And Aldenham, Shropshire, England, almost 60,000. He marked thousands of passages he considered important. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Munich, 1873. Honorary Doctor of Laws from Cambridge University, 1889, and Honorary Doctor of Civil Law from Oxford University, 1890, yet he never earned an academic degree in his life, not even a high school diploma. To be sure, Acton had some big blind spots. Science didn't interest him. Although he expressed concern for the poor, he spurned as materialistic the Manchester liberals who cared about raising living standards. He knew little about economic history, which tells how ordinary people fared. What was Acton like? Published photographs generally show him with a long beard. He had piercing blue eyes and a high forehead. He was of middle height, and as he grew older he developed a full figure, added biographer David Matthew. He was renowned as a conversationalist, but his talk was on the German model, full of facts and references. He enjoyed walking, traversing the lower slopes of the Bavarian mountains, or wandering on the lip of the Alps Maritimes, where they fall towards the sea. Acton conveyed tremendous passion. There was a magnetic quality in the tones of his voice, recalled one student who heard his Cambridge lectures. Never before had a young man come into the presence of such intensity of conviction as was shown by every word Lord Acton spoke. It took possession of the whole being, and seemed to enfold it in its own burning flame. And the fires below on which it fed were, at least for those present, immeasurable. More than all else, it was perhaps this conviction that gave to Lord Acton's lectures their amazing force and vivacity. He pronounced each sentence as if he were feeling it, poising it lightly, and uttering it with measured deliberation. His feeling passed to the audience, which sat enthralled. John Emmerich Edward Dalberg Acton was born January 10, 1834, in Naples. His mother Marie-Pauline de Dalberg was from a Bavarian Catholic family with roots in the French aristocracy. His father Ferdinand Richard Edward Acton, long names seem to run in the family, was an English aristocrat. Acton's father died when he was 3 years old, and by the time he was 6 his mother had remarried Lord Leveson, who later served as foreign minister in the Liberal cabinet of Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone. Acton was mainly educated as a Catholic, St. Nicholas, France, St. Mary's, Oscott, England, the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he studied 2 years, and the University of Munich, Bavaria, where he went after being refused admission to Cambridge and Oxford because of his Catholicism. Soon after Acton arrived in Munich, June 1850, he began his apprenticeship to become an historian. "I breakfast at 8, he wrote his stepfather, then 2 hours of German, an hour of Plutarch, and an hour of Tacitus. This proportion was recommended by the professor. We dine a little before 2, I see him then for the first time in the day. At 3 my German master comes. From 4 till 7 I am out, I read modern history for an hour, having had an hour's ancient history just before dinner. I have some tea at 8 and study English literature and composition till 10, when the curtain falls." Johann Ignaz von Dollinger, among Europe's most distinguished historians, was Acton's most important teacher. Acton and Dollinger traveled in Austria, England, Germany, Italy and Switzerland, visiting libraries and bookstores. They analyzed manuscripts and met with poets, historians, scientists and statesmen. While with Dollinger, Acton attended lectures by the great German historian Leopold von Ranke, who stressed that the role of an historian was to explain the past, not to judge it. Those familiar with Acton's famous blasts against tyranny will be startled at his early conservatism. For instance, unlike Manchester liberals such as Richard Cobden and John Bright, but along with most Englishmen, Acton sided with the South during the American Civil War. It is as impossible to sympathize on religious grounds with the categorical prohibition of slavery as, on political grounds, with the opinions of the abolitionists, he wrote in his essay The Political Causes of the American Revolution, 1861. 5 years later, in a lecture about the Civil War, Acton remarked that slavery has been a mighty instrument not for evil only, but for good in the providential order of the world. By awakening the spirit of sacrifice on the one hand, and the spirit of charity on the other. In the Protestant Theory of Persecution, 1862, he refused to condemn persecution across the board. He seemed to defend Catholic rulers who claimed persecution was the only way of keeping society together. He suggested Protestants like John Calvin were worse, because they persecuted people just to suppress dissident views. In private, Acton was more outspoken. To say that persecution is wrong, nakedly, seems to me first of all untrue. Yet Dollinger and Acton became outspoken critics of Catholic intolerance. Their contemporary targets were the Ultramontans, who sought to suppress freedom of thought. Dollinger and Acton took issue with Vatican policy, especially after Pope Pius IX issued his notorious Syllabus of Errors, 1864, which condemned alleged heresies including the scandalous idea that the Roman pontiff cannot to reconcile himself to, and agree with, progress, liberalism and recent civilization. Acton contributed to a succession of Catholic journals whose mission was to help liberalize the Church: the bi-monthly Rambler, 1858–1862, Quarterly Home and Foreign Review, 1862–1864, and Weekly Chronicle, 1867–1868. These efforts were defeated in 1870 when the Vatican Council declared that the Pope was an infallible authority on church dogma. Because Dollinger was a priest, his refusal to submit resulted in excommunication. Acton, a layman, wasn't required to officially acknowledge the Vatican Council decrees, and he remained within the Church. It was during this period that Acton wrote one of his most prophetic essays, Nationality, 1862, which offered an early warning about totalitarianism. Whenever a single definite object is made the supreme end of the state, be it the advantage of a class, the safety or the power of a country, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or the support of any speculative idea, the state becomes for the time inevitably absolute. Liberty alone demands for its realization the limitation of the public authority, for liberty is the only object which benefits all alike, and provokes no sincere opposition. Meanwhile, in 1865, Acton at 31 had married a cousin, Countess Marie Annela de Millau in Arco Valley. She was the 24-year-old daughter of Count Johann Maximilian Arco Valley, who had introduced Dollinger to Acton, so they had known each other ever since he began his studies in Bavaria. She seems to have shared his interests in religion and history. They had 6 children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. At meals, Acton spoke German with his wife, Italian with his mother-in-law, French with his sister-in-law, English with his children, and perhaps another European language with the visitor. Religion was always on Acton's mind, and he came around to the view, shared with the eloquent historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, that historians must expose evil. In February 1879, he split with Dollinger after the professor had taken the view that an historian should remain silent.